fellow assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins Podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. So, welcome back to the weekend, my fellow assassins. I hope you all had a good week. I know I had a great week. If you listened to last week's episode, you heard I kind of teased some things that were upcoming, and some, not all, but some of those things came to fruition, which we're going to talk about today. And I mean, where else would I be in a happier place than spending time in my data center, aka my Homelab, tinkering away and just having a ball. And let me tell you guys, SSDs do indeed make VMs go burr. But that's not the only exciting news that we got this week. Apple announced their Worldwide Developers Conference, which we're going to talk about a little bit in this episode too. Which, I mean, when it comes to the Worldwide Developers Conference, or WWDC, I mean, it's basically just like Christmas for us developers with all the good software and new development tools and all that good stuff that gets announced. But before we get into this week's episode, let's get into this week's trivia question, which in honor of Apple announcing their WWDC event, this week's trivia question is, what year was the first WWDC held? So what was the first year that WWDC was held? So that is the trivia question for this week. Also, I don't know if you guys remember, but like a while back, I mentioned that like some company tried to reach out to me about like, they were like, "Oh, we make websites for podcasters. We'll make you a website." And I was like, and I'm just sitting here like, do you not like listen to the podcast or know anything about the podcast? Because if you did, you would know that we have a website. But anyway, I got another one of those emails today, or maybe it wasn't today, but I saw it today, which I found kind of funny because, again, like if you actually listened to the podcast and, actually followed any information about us here at Dark Assassins Inc., you would know that we have a website for the podcast. So if you're listening, which you're probably not because I'm assuming that was just an automated email, I am good. I already have a website, so thank you very much. Now, before we get into this week's cybersecurity tip, I do want to allude to a previous cybersecurity tip that we talked about, which was when you get an email from a company saying that there was like suspicious activity on your account or whatever, and you should change your update your security settings and all that stuff. Here, click the link and go do that. So I got an email from Microsoft today saying basically that same thing for a Microsoft account. And I was like, this seems a little suspicious. So I did what, the cybersecurity tip was. I checked the email of the sender, and it was actually a legit Microsoft email. So I was like, okay, so they got some points there. Let me hover over this link real quick and see where it's trying to take me. And it was trying to take me, I believe it was to accounts.live.com or something like that. And I was like, that's not a Microsoft site. At least it doesn't have like Microsoft in the name or anything. So I was like, yeah, I don't know about this one. But out of abundance of caution, I went to my handy dandy web browser and went to Microsoft.com and then went to go sign into my account and, change the password and all that good stuff, doing it that way. And actually, it turns out that the site that they were trying to take me to in the email was actually the legit website. But just out of abundance of caution, went through the slightly slower route, but more secure route of actually going directly through their website to making sure that all was good. So there, another instance where a cybersecurity tip actually paid off. So that's always good to see. Now, with that out of the way, let's get into this week's cybersecurity tip. So for this week's cybersecurity tip, I mentioned last week that I had one, but there was something a little more pressing with the whole incident with Linus. Which actually, I'm not sure if you guys caught it or not, but I did put a link in the show notes of last week's episode to the YouTube video that Linus put out about just going over the attack and kind of what happened and all that stuff. So just for your awareness. But this week's cybersecurity tip is actually, again, different than the one I originally planned for last week, which, because it kind of came to me, and I was like, yeah, this is a pretty good one, I think. So this week's cybersecurity tip is don't go picking up, if you find a USB anywhere on the ground, don't plug it into your computer, because, chances are, it could be harmless, but at the same time, cyber criminals and pen testers love this method as a way to hack people. And the reason they do that, the reason it's effective, is because, it piques your curiosity, right? Like, you see a little USB drive, on the floor, on the ground of, say, the parking lot, or wherever you are, and you're like, I wonder what's on this USB. So you pick it up, and, how else are you going to see what's on the USB but plug it into your computer? And then a couple things could happen, or a few things, I guess. One, nothing happens, and it's just a USB. There's either nothing interesting on there or whatever. Two, it's actually someone's USB, and there's personal information on there, or I don't know, some other files or whatever. And then another option is there's malware on there that takes over your computer. Or sometimes the malware will be on the flash drive and make it look inconspicuous, like there's nothing there, but they'll get you. So this is actually a pretty common way that pen testers will use when they're trying to do security audits for companies and whatnot. So a quick, I guess, recap about what pen testing is. If you're not familiar with what pen testing is, it's basically what happens is a company will hire some other company to try to hack them, and basically they won't tell any of their employees or whatever that this is going on. And they'll hire this pen testing company, and they'll try all different ways to gain unauthorized access to things, or compromise systems or whatever. And basically the point of it is to create a write-up or some kind of other documentation to say, hey, we found X vulnerability on this system, this is what we did to exploit it, and this is what we were able to do once we did exploit it. And then, but can even be more basic than that too. It can even be we didn't have any credentials to the building, but we were, carrying a heavy box, and we asked someone to hold the door for us, and we were able to get in, and then that allowed us to navigate to computer systems that we were able to access, and yada, yada, yada. But another thing that they'll do is they'll drop USBs, around the corporate parking lot, or, wherever the case may be, maybe inside the building, and on those USBs, they'll have malware on there that will, access your credentials for something, or send the pen tester information about your system or whatever, about information about the network. If you're interested in these kind of malware type USBs, look up the rubber ducky USB, and that's kind of sort of what's going on here. But cyber criminals also obviously use it too. But if you do really, really want to know what's on that USB, the only thing I can say is, first off, don't do it. But if you're going to do it, the first thing always when you're dealing with any sort of malware is containment. You need to make sure that there is no way that whatever's on that USB can do damage. So the best way that you could, one of the best ways you could handle it would be to take some throwaway laptop or desktop or something you don't care about that has nothing on it. Potentially you even have a fresh install of an operating system on there that you freshly installed for this specific purpose. And the key is that you make sure it's not connected to the internet whatsoever, because if, for example, there was some kind of malware on this USB that can access, networks and infiltrate like a worm and, go through systems and lateral movement, and not good. So you want to make sure that you're not connected to the internet. That would be obvious step number one. And the other thing, like I mentioned, was you want to make sure there's nothing of value and really nothing on the machine you're plugging it into. Because if that USB potentially has ransomware on it, you don't want all of your files getting encrypted because you were curious as to what was on this USB. Now, potentially one thing you could do if you didn't have an extra, device lying around, like an extra desktop or laptop, maybe you're not a hoarder of ancient technology like I am and you don't have that luxury, what you could do is you could make sure if you have the ability to, like if you have a SATA SSD or an NVMe SSD in your computer and you can take it out, what I would do is, if you don't have an extra device, take out whatever your main drive is and disconnect all your drives in your computer, and then flash a live USB, like, say Ubuntu, for example. You flash a live Ubuntu ISO onto another USB and then boot into that live instance. So you have essentially an operating system, but, there's nothing to it. It's literally just a live ISO file running in memory. So there's literally nothing. Even if there was, say, ransomware on there, it's not going to do anything to your system, obviously. And then through that live environment, obviously disconnected from the internet and all that good stuff, then you could plug the USB in and see what was on there. So if you really, really, really have to know what's on that USB, those would be the steps that I would take to make sure that you mitigate as many risks as possible to not get hacked. But at the end of the day, I still don't recommend even picking them up in the first place. So that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. Now, let's get into the Christmas that I guess you could say that Apple dropped, with that, of course, being WWDC for 2023 has been officially announced. There were some rumors about, the date for the past, I guess, maybe a few weeks or whatever, but it was officially announced, and the dates are June 5th to June 9th. And if you're wondering, I thought WWDC was just a keynote event that they did. It is a keynote event that they did, but the keynote event that they give is essentially like the Kickstarter or, the grand opening to the event. But it's a week-long event. Like if you've ever been to, it's a conference, the Worldwide Developers Conference. If you've ever been to any kind of conference for some other, workshopping type thing or organizational conference, like a couple examples for this would be like the Boy Scouts of America. They have their like jamboree And then their affiliate, the Order of the Arrow, has their National Order of the Arrow Conference. Similar to WWDC, they're all a week long, and like the first day there's like a big opening, ceremony, like welcome to the event, yada yada yada. So that's basically what WWDC is. Because WWDC is obviously software focused, and the whole week-long event is software-focused and, focusing on different workshops and working with the new development tools and the new APIs and all that good stuff, you kind of gotta reveal the new gadgets and the new software and all that good stuff before you can do the workshops on, how to use it. You have to introduce it first. And that's kind of the point of WWDC. So, what should you be looking forward to in WWDC this year? So, obviously, you got your standard, the bread and butter. You got your operating system releases, right? So, you'll see iOS, what are they up to now? 17, iOS 17, iPadOS 17, macOS, I'm assuming probably 14, because they seem to be going on a year or a number increment now, whereas if you remember back to last week, the trivia question, how they were on 10 for so long, and then once Big Sur started, they started incrementing the primary number. So I'm assuming it'll be 14. What it's going to be called, I don't know. I guess that'll be up to the crack marketing team over at Apple, like our boy Air Force One Craig Federighi always says when he mentions them. And obviously, Craig Federighi, our boy Air Force One, we salute you, good sir. He will almost definitely be making an appearance and playing a large role, as he's I forget exactly what his title is. He's like, I want to say the senior VP of software development or software engineering, one of the two. He's basically in charge of all the software that goes on at Apple, pretty much. So he's obviously going to be playing a huge role. In my opinion anyway, definitely hands down one of the best parts of WWDC, getting to see his antics. So definitely looking forward to that. So yeah, we're going to get the OS releases, see all the new features. But then from the developer aspect, they're almost definitely going to be announcing some new, I don't know what they are, but they're going to be announcing some new APIs and some new frameworks. Potentially some new updates to Swift, which is their programming language that you have to use when developing for specifically iPadOS and iOS. You can use Swift when developing for Macs as well, but because macOS is a desktop environment, you can easily just write Python programs or Java programs or C and C++ programs, Rust programs, Go programs. I mean, pretty much sky's the limit. You can write whatever language you want and it'll work on macOS. But native, I guess, quote unquote native macOS apps are, I don't know. They say Swift, but if I go into Xcode, I can write macOS apps with C++ as like a console app or even C. So, I don't know. But yeah, they're going to announce probably some new updates with Swift. So probably some new APIs, maybe some improvements to other APIs as well. So anyone out there developing for any kind of iOS, iPadOS, macOS, definitely going to want to be in tune for those, since they usually, when they talk about the new API updates and whatnot, they generally are pretty darn cool, some of the features that they allow you to do and utilize. Like I know they already have features to allow you to essentially plug into Apple's Maps network, weather network, all kinds of things that you can do with just some simple API calls, which is definitely really nice. Some other things that we could potentially look forward to seeing. I know we talked about it a few weeks ago. There's been more and more rumors coming up about the whole whatever this mixed reality, virtual reality, AR, VR headset thing that they're working on. Supposedly, allegedly, if the rumors are to be believed, that'll be coming at WWDC as well, which, as we talked about when we brought it up initially, it would make sense that WWDC would be the event that would be launched at, because like when they transitioned from Intel to Apple Silicon, you need the developers to be on board to make apps for the new product before it actually releases, because if you don't have apps for the new product and it releases, no one's going to really want to use it because you can't really do anything for it. Obviously, Apple's going to have their whole suite of first-party software that they have on there, but the third-party developers, the you and me developers, we need to be on board, to start making apps for this device before it launches to the general public, so they actually have something to do with this headset. And what better place if you need to, get all the developers on board than the event that is focused on developers. So, assuming that this headset gets announced at WWDC, we'll probably see a couple things. One, we'll probably see some kind of prototype. I guess it'd be probably past the prototype stage, but obviously nowhere near mass production. We'll see some kind of visual of it, like what it looks like, maybe some example demos of, how it's used, that kind of thing, and kind of get an overview of whatever they're calling this OS that's running on the headset. I think I've heard like Reality OS might have been one of the names floating around. Obviously, I have no idea if that's it. But most likely it's probably going to be some kind of like forked version of iPad OS, iOS, Mac OS, because they're kind of sort of all converging. I don't know if you saw what the latest version of Mac OS, the settings looks like. It's almost a complete clone of the iPad and the iPhone, kind of sort of, with just a few more options. So it's probably going to be some kind of forked off that kind. Like I think watchOS might also be kind of some sort of fork. And I know when the iPhone first released, that was originally a fork from macOS. So I mean, they're kind of all forks from the same. They're all growing from the same tree, apple tree. Haha, boom. But obviously they're going to be tailored to fit the specific use case. So if this headset does get announced at WWDC, definitely going to see some features for the OS that it has and some first-party apps that Apple's developed. Probably see some demos. And then they're almost definitely going to talk about some of the APIs and development methodologies and tools that'll be used to basically how to develop for it. There'll probably be one thing that one thing that I find interesting and will be interesting to see is how they plan on integrating some kind of simulator into Xcode. Because when you try to develop apps, like for iOS and iPadOS, for example, and even watchOS, they have simulators built in to Xcode, so you can run your code and basically see on the simulator, it's basically a dummy iPhone or a dummy iPad or a dummy Apple Watch, whatever, to see how your app will function. So you don't necessarily need to have your phone plugged in or your iPad plugged in or whatever, and load that app directly onto your device and test it there. You can do that, but you don't have to. So the thing that I will find interesting is how they'll integrate some kind of simulator into Xcode, because obviously you're going to need to test your code somehow, and I highly doubt that Apple's just going to willy-nilly be sending out prototype devices to any developer who wants to make an app for this thing, right? Now, they'll be happy to sell you one once it actually comes out so you can develop for it. But in the meantime, before it becomes widely available, they're going to have some way for people to build and test apps to make sure it'll actually work on this thing when it does come out. Now, obviously, there probably will be some developers, like maybe some bigger name studios or other bigger developers, that will get some kind of, early access, first access to this device. And kind of like when they did their transition over to Apple Silicon, they had their developer transition kit where they would send it out to just developers so they could, work on porting their apps over to Apple Silicon. Although I guess one thing with that instance was that you actually had to pay for the DTK, I believe, back when it came out, and then you didn't even get to keep it. I don't remember if you got a refund, like once you inevitably sent the device back. I'm not sure. I didn't have one, so I don't know. But yeah, that's one thing that I'm going to be really interested in seeing, assuming that, or whenever because I think it's pretty much safe to say that at some point they're going to be releasing this headset, because it's been all over the news and in the rumors. It's just a matter of when. And in my personal opinion, WWDC just makes the most sense. So, but even still, whenever this thing comes out, or I should say gets announced, because when it gets announced, it's probably going to be at least a few months, if not a full year, before it actually gets into goes up for sale and you can buy one. Because like we mentioned when we first talked about this, you have to have apps and developers making apps for the device before you can, push it to the mass market. So yeah, and I'm going to be really interested to see how they integrate some kind of simulator for this thing, because if it's supposed to be some kind of virtual reality / augmented reality, it'll be really interesting to see how they would, simulate that so you could test apps within Xcode. So that's going to be something that I'll be really looking forward to. Aside from that, I think that's probably the main things to look forward to at WWDC. There's also been some rumors about some potential other hardware, like maybe the new M3 chip or some new iPad Airs or the Mac Pro. The problem there is, first off, WWDC is strictly a software event. It's oriented around software. So having, all this hardware, I'm not sure. I could see them releasing the M3 chip, because last year they released, I believe it was last year, or at least when they first announced Apple Silicon, at the very least, that was at WWDC. So, and seeing that that's, like an Apple chip and that kind of thing, I could potentially see M3 be announced maybe at WWDC, and maybe like the MacBook Airs would, I guess, potentially make sense, because there would be the entry level, the first devices with it. But the Mac Pro is obviously going to be, much higher end, and I kind of doubt they would announce the entire M3 lineup unless they're giving the Mac Pro and M2. I don't know. I think it's hard to say. Those are kind of up in the air, I would say. But obviously, definitely look forward to the new operating systems that are going to be coming out, new APIs and new, development tools, that kind of thing, updates to Xcode. And also, as the thing to potentially look out for is that headset. So those are the things to look out for WWDC. And really, I guess we're almost in April now, so 2 months and like a week or something like that, and WWDC will be here. And we will definitely be having some coverage here on the Dark Assassins podcast. So make sure to tune in June when that happens. So now let's get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So this week, actually, before we even get into that teaser that I brought up last time, do you guys remember months ago when I mentioned that I got a pretty good deal on a new network switch that had 2 SFP Plus ports that would allow me to have 10 gig Ethernet? And ever since then, it's been complete radio silence on my end about anything 10 gig related. Oh, you don't? Well, I mean, like I said, it was a while ago. Or if you do remember, kudos to you. But yes, we're actually getting back to that. We got fiber up in here. I was running some fiber this week. Not really much. It was just one cable. So I guess it's kind of realistically, I'm not, and honestly, I'm not even running at 10 gig anyway. And I only have one device hooked up to 10 gig, which is my NAS. And even that thing isn't running at 10 gig, which I guess should be pretty obvious as to why it's not running at 10 gig. Seeing that it has 3 disks on it in a RAID 5. So that's problem number 1, like we talked about last week with the SSDs when I mentioned that teaser. RAID 5, well, it will give you some read performance increases. It doesn't do anything for your write performance. And seeing that the disks I have are spinning hard drives, aka spinning Rust, not exactly the fastest. So we got some big time bottlenecks going on. But with that said, it will allow me to pump more data to the NAS or out of the NAS regardless, because as we mentioned when we kind of did that big overview of networking some months ago, the point of, 10 gig and 25 gig, 40 gig, 100 gig, all these massive, gigabits per second, generally speaking, once you get to those levels, not all cases, but a lot of cases, you're using it for how much data you can push through these pipes rather than being able to, transfer large files at the same, quickly. So you're not, using 100 gig Ethernet, to download, your Steam library, right? Although that would be pretty cool. You're using 100 gig Ethernet to be able to handle a bunch of smaller connections all going to the same place. So the point, which is the reason I, used my NAS as the first device to get onto the 10 gig bandwagon or 10 gig train, because it's the NAS and it's a network attached storage. So any device on my network that wants to access it would be trying to pull data from there. And if my pipe is only 1 gigabit, even if I can saturate that 1 gigabit connection, if other devices try to access it, it's only a 1 gigabit connection, so only 1 gigabit can go through at a time. It doesn't matter, if I could, push more data through it, I can only push through a gigabit at a time. And if I have multiple devices all trying to, get time through that pipe at the same time, bottlenecks ensue. So having a 10 gig link there will be beneficial, because even though the NAS won't be able to, necessarily operate at 10 gig, it can be able to better handle multiple 1 gig connections at the same time because that pipe is bigger. Now, I did run some testing, which you might be wondering, how the heck did I run testing if the only device I have is the NAS? which that was actually my first question too. And then I realized something. Wait a second. I can just log into the NAS and then do a file transfer to itself on the connection that's 10 gig. So I basically force it to use the 10 gig connection. So that's what I did. And there's a couple things to take away from this experiment. The first one is it's a pretty big letdown how much slower it is from the theoretical max of 10 gig. So the theoretical max of a 10 gigabit per second connection is like 1 gigabyte and change, essentially. And I wasn't getting anywhere close to that. But the good news is I was getting well over a gigabit per second speed. So if you're able to download or upload or send data at a gigabit per second, 1 gigabit per second, you're looking at around 100 megabytes per second, which I think technically it's more like 120 or 112, somewhere in that range. It's around 100. Theoretically, if you're transferring at a gigabit because of various overheads and whatnot, you're going to be around 100 megabytes per second, give or take. Generally speaking, when you talk about these, 1 gig, 1 gigabit, 10 gigabit, whatever, you generally never see the theoretical maximum, even if there are no bottlenecks and your system can supply them or supply that speed, essentially. But with that said, that obviously wasn't the issue here. There was no overhead. It was just spinning rust, and my hardware is not beefy enough to handle the 10 gig. But with that said, I did test the connection, and I saw speeds almost at 240 megabytes per second, which, yeah, it ain't even close to the theoretical max of 10 gig. But seeing that I've been stuck at 1 gig for the longest time, seeing something almost basically double that of gigabit was pretty impressive. I was pretty hyped to see that, even though it was still significantly slower than the theoretical max of 10 gig. But for comparison's sake, I was trying to transfer a Windows ISO, which was around 5.5 gigs worth of data. And over that quote-unquote 10 gig connection, it transferred in about 24 seconds. So 5.5 gigs in 24 seconds, not too shabby if you ask me. Of course, the other thing that obviously is nice is I have fiber running in my house, which is pretty cool. And also, I get to add more blinky lights to the light show, so my data center / rack looks even more like a Christmas tree now, with even more blinky lights. But speaking of blinky lights, those were not the only new blinky lights that I added to my server rack this week, because as I kind of teased last week about those enterprise-grade SSDs for basically dirt cheap, I bought some. And if you were worried with that $70 asking price, or a little less than $70 for that much storage, thinking it was a scam, rest assured it was not a scam. It was definitely not a scam. And oh boy, those SSDs are working real fine right now. So I upgraded 2 of my servers. Well, technically I only upgraded one of them. We'll get to why the second one, I say I didn't really upgrade it in a little bit here. The first one, unsurprisingly, my Dell PowerEdge R620 upgraded without a hitch. No problems whatsoever. And when I say upgraded without a hitch, ladies and gentlemen, I didn't even have to power the thing off, and I was able to upgrade it with the SSDs, migrate my VMs to the SSD storage, and off away I was. No downtime whatsoever. So that was glorious. Gotta love those hot swappable bays on servers like that. That is definitely one thing that is very, very nice about rack-mounted equipment, which, in fairness, not all rack-mounted gear does have hot swappable drive bays in the front. So I can't say... And I guess, on the other hand, there are some... desktops, which they're generally more the like the premium workstation type stuff that have hot swappable bays on them. But needless to say, hot swappable bays when you're trying to upgrade storage like this is pretty darn nice. So then, of course, once I did install the new SSDs into the R620, getting to watch the Christmas light show of all those drives blinking away as I'm, migrating the VMs was pretty nice to watch. Which I will say, honestly, this R620 has been absolutely rock solid for everything that I've tried to do with it. It has never let me down. The only time it did let me down was because I was dumb and I installed a CPU wrong, which that's not the server's fault. That was my fault for being dumb, because I think I mentioned this story on the podcast. A while ago, I upgraded the CPUs in my R620, and when I upgraded them, for some reason, not all the RAM was detected anymore, which I did some swapping around of the RAM modules to mitigate how much RAM would be lost, and just called it a day at that. But then I forget exactly the reason why I did it. I think I took it down for some other kind of maintenance. I forget what it was. And I removed the CPU, the heatsink in the CPU, and of course there was dust under the CPU, so it wasn't, making a perfect pin contact with the CPU. Took a can of compressed air, blew that out, reinstalled the CPU, and wouldn't you know it, everything was working perfectly again. So aside from the one time that I was just dumb and operator error, it has never failed to let me down, and that thing is an absolute champ. So definitely love that thing for sure. Now, let's get over to the other server that I mentioned I tried to upgrade but didn't upgrade. So, this one is a bit of an interesting story. So, this server, like the R620, also has hot swappable bays on the front of it. And I installed the SSDs into it first, which the irony of this was that was the first server I put the SSDs in, and I was screwing them into the caddies, the SSDs into the caddies, and I was like, you know what I should do? If I was smart, I would just put one in here, slide it into the server, test it first, make sure it works before I do all of them. But as you can guess, I did not do that. I did all of them. So I put all of them in their caddies, slid them into the server. The lights lit up on the caddies, which tells you that there is a drive there. Of course, there was no real blinking lights because there was no activity on the drive going on because they're not formatted. No data is being written to them. None of that stuff. And when I went into Proxmox, I did not see the new drives show up. And I thought that was kind of weird, but I was like, you know what? Maybe it just needs a reboot. Maybe it's not a champ like the R620 is. Maybe it just needs a reboot. Gave it a reboot. That didn't fix the issue. So I was like, oh man, and obviously keep in mind that I did the server first. I did the R620 second. So at this point, I was actually wondering, oh shoot, did I actually get scammed here? But thankfully, no, I didn't, obviously, as seen with the R620. But also, one thing I tested was, well, actually, let me take a step back. This server, I had kind of heard / known that it didn't have both mini SAS connectors on it. And my kind of assumption was maybe that was just you don't get the full speed, but you could connect more drives. No, you just can't connect more drives. So basically, how these enterprise systems work, and other systems too, but specifically these, basically what happens is the front part of the server is drive space. So you can slide hot swap drives in and out. And the way that this works is behind those drives, there's what's called a backplane, which basically just has, the connectors for the drives on them. So in this case, I'm using SATA drives. So it has the SATA connector and the SATA power connector that when you slide the drive into, it connects into. Now, in order for you to actually use those drives, you have to have power and data connectors going to that backplane to be able to send the data back to the motherboard or hardware RAID controller or whatever, and have power going to the backplane so you can actually power the drives. So the backplane had power, but it was missing that other data connector plugging into the backplane to actually connect the drive slots that I was plugging my drives into. So I wasn't able to get any data to them, which was why Proxmox didn't recognize them, because they weren't wired up. It's like if you plugged in... So basically, imagine if you were installing a new hard drive into your desktop and you plugged the power in, but you didn't plug the data in. Obviously, the drive's not going to show up because it's not actually plugged into the computer. So that's basically what happened here. But I did test. I did have one free drive slot available that was wired up. And I tried, plugging the SSDs into that free one. And when I plugged them into there, they showed up no problem. So... And then afterwards, I did power off the system, and that's where I confirmed that, it's missing this data cable, which I kind of knew. So I did order a new cable, so that should be coming, I believe, probably early next week, or I guess since this goes out on Saturday. So probably like Monday, Tuesday-ish, I think, is supposedly when it's supposed to show up. So I think... So hopefully, by next week's episode, I will have an update on that server. But in addition, I teased a lot of good stuff up and coming, and I still have some other goodies, specifically one, I guess, that hasn't arrived yet. And, that should, again, be here either this weekend or... I'm recording this before the weekend, so either I'll have it like when this podcast goes out, or it'll be again like that cable, like Monday, Tuesday-ish of next week. And that one I am really looking forward to. That's going to be some more really diving into Homelab stuff, really getting into some fun goodies. So I am definitely looking forward to that when it comes in. So you'll definitely want to stay tuned. And also, I have another really interesting episode coming up for you guys in a couple weeks, hopefully a couple weeks too. I have some other things planned, which you're definitely not going to want to miss. But I think that's probably going to wrap it up for this episode. But before we go, we talked about WWDC. Our trivia question was about WWDC. So let's get back to that trivia question. So if you recall, this week's trivia question is, what year was the first WWDC held? And if you said 1983, you are correct, which honestly, I'm kind of surprised it's been going on since the 80s, specifically the early 80s. Like, I was thinking that this was kind of a more recent thing. I didn't realize it had been around for that long. Although, I guess in fairness, when it first came out, they weren't annual things. When they first did WWDC, it wasn't like an every year thing, I don't believe. But now it's kind of become more of an annual thing. So maybe potentially that was why. I don't know. It's definitely, I think, become a much more bigger deal now than it was in the earlier days, or the first few WWDCs, because actually 83, the first Macintosh, the original Macintosh, hadn't even come out yet, since that was 1984. So, yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, that's this week's trivia question. WWDC, been around since 1983. Hey, that rhymed. That was not intentional. But, so if you enjoyed this episode, I ask that you leave it a rating and review and subscribe to the Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. Also, be sure to share with a friend or family member who you think would enjoy it. Maybe they want to hear a sneak peek of WWDC. And if you have any questions about this episode, or you have any topics you want me to cover in future episodes, you can shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. There is a link for that down in the show notes below that you can click on and send me an email. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.